The knock never came. That was the first thing that struck Caleb Whitfield as wrong. The way she didn't knock, didn't call out, didn't do anything. A stranger arriving at a ranch house after dark would normally do. He only heard the soft, terrible sound of a body hitting the porch boards, a weight collapsing all at once like something that had been holding itself upright through sheer will, and had finally run out of will to spend. He was up from his chair by the fire before he'd even finished thinking, rifle left behind because some instinct deeper than caution told him this wasn't danger walking toward him. This was danger that had already happened to someone else. He threw open the door and found her there, crumpled against the porch post, one arm wrapped around her ribs, dark hair falling loose and matted across a face bruised along the cheekbone, a thin cotton dress torn at the shoulder and stained with dust and something darker underneath. She couldn't have been more than 25. She looked, in that first terrible moment, like something the world had already finished with and thrown away. Her eyes fluttered open when his shadow fell over her, wide and glassy with pain, and her lips moved, cracked and trembling, forming words so faint he had to lean down close just to catch them. "They hurt me," she whispered. "Please, they hurt me." And then her eyes rolled back and she went still, and for one horrifying second Caleb thought she was gone entirely. Thought whatever had happened to her out there in the dark had finished the job before she ever reached his porch. He pressed 2 fingers to her throat with hands that were shaking despite 11 years of ranch work that had made those same hands steady through calving seasons, through broken bones, through burying his own father 2 winters back. Her pulse was there, faint, fluttering, but there. He gathered her up off the boards as gently as a man could manage when every second felt like it mattered more than the last. And he carried her inside, laid her on the bed in the spare room that hadn't held a guest in longer than he cared to count. And he did the only thing he knew to do. He rode for the doctor himself rather than sending a hand, because he could not make himself leave the yard without seeing that horse moving at a dead run toward town, and he did not trust anyone else's urgency to match his own. If a story like this pulls at something in your chest, that instinct to protect someone the world has already failed once, stay with me. Because what Caleb uncovers in the days that follow is going to change everything you think you understand about second chances. And if stories like these matter to you, consider subscribing before we go further, because there's so much more heart waiting in what comes next. Doc Ellison arrived within the hour, grim-faced and quiet in the particular way of a man who had seen enough of this kind of hurt to know better than to ask too many questions too soon. He worked over her by lantern light while Caleb paced the hallway outside, and when the doctor finally stepped out, wiping his hands on a cloth, his expression carried the careful weight of a man delivering news he wished he didn't have to deliver. 2 cracked ribs, he said quietly, bruising all through her side and along her jaw, consistent with being struck more than once. She's dehydrated bad. Looks like she's been walking a good long while without food or water. No fever yet, which is a mercy, but she needs rest, and she needs someone patient enough not to push her for answers before she's ready to give them. He studied Caleb a moment. "You got any idea who she is?" "None," Caleb admitted. "Never seen her before in my life." "Well," Doc Ellison said, gathering his bag, "whoever did this to her, they meant to do worse than they managed. She's lucky she made it as far as your porch." She slept through that first night and most of the next day, and Caleb sat outside her door more often than not, unable to settle into any other task, his ranch hands handling the morning chores without him for the first time and longer than any of them could remember. When she finally woke on the second evening, her eyes opened slow and wary, taking in the unfamiliar room, the lamplight, the strange man's shirt someone had draped over the chair beside the bed, and Caleb watched fear flood through her expression before recognition of safety had the chance to catch up. "You're all right," he said quietly from the doorway, keeping his voice low and even, keeping his distance so as not to crowd her. "You're safe here. Nobody's going to hurt you in this house." She stared at him for a long moment, her breathing quick and shallow, and then, slowly, some of the tension eased from her shoulders, though the wariness in her eyes did not fully leave. "Where am I?" she whispered. "Whitfield Ranch, about 8 miles outside town. You collapsed on my porch 2 nights back." He kept his hands visible, kept his posture relaxed, every instinct in him aware of how a frightened animal, or a frightened person, needed room to trust rather than reasons to run. "You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to tell me. Just wanted you to know you're safe and you can stay as long as you need." Her name, she told him eventually, in halting pieces over the following days, was Delia Frost, and the story came slower than her name had, told in fragments she seemed to have to gather courage for before each new piece, like a woman handing over something precious and terrified it would be dropped. She had come west from Missouri 2 years back with her husband, a man named Elias Frost, following the promise of land and opportunity that so many families chased in those years. What she hadn't known, not until they had already sold everything and traveled 1,000 miles from anyone who might have helped her, was that Elias carried a temper that grew crueler with every mile. Every hardship, every disappointment the frontier handed him instead of the fortune he'd promised her, It started small, she said one evening, staring at her hands folded in her lap, unable to look at Caleb while she spoke. A harsh word here, a slammed door there. I told myself it was just the stress of it all, the new land, the hard winters, the crops failing that first year. I told myself it would get better. Her voice grew quieter still. It didn't get better, it got worse. And by the time I understood what I'd married, we were 300 miles from my family, and he made certain I stayed that far, made certain there was nowhere for me to run to, even if I found the courage. Caleb sat very still, his jaw tight, his hands curled loosely on his knees, listening with a stillness that Delia would later tell him made all the difference, because it wasn't the stillness of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but the stillness of a man who understood that some stories needed room to breathe before anyone tried to fix them. 3 nights ago, she continued, he came home from town in a mood I'd learned to fear worse than most, and when I tried to leave the house, tried just to get some air, get some distance before things turned bad, Her voice broke, and she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, and Caleb waited, patient, saying nothing, letting her find her own way back to the words. He struck me harder than he ever had before, said things I won't repeat, and something in me just knew, right then, that if I stayed one more night in that house, I might not survive to see another one. She swallowed hard. I ran the moment he passed out drunk in his chair. Just ran, in the dark, no plan, no money, nothing but the clothes on my back. I don't even know how far I walked before I saw your porch light. You were smart to run, Caleb said quietly, when he trusted his voice enough to speak without the anger burning in his chest bleeding into his tone and frightening her further. Smarter still to keep going till you found somewhere safe. You don't know that it's safe, Delia said, and for the first time since she'd woken, something like real fear crossed her face. He'll come looking. Elias doesn't let go of things easy, and he'll be humiliated, I ran, and a man like him doesn't handle humiliation quietly. Let him come, Caleb said. And though his voice stayed even, there was something underneath it now, something hard and immovable, the voice of a man who had buried a father, run a ranch alone through drought and hardship, and had never once in his life backed down from protecting what mattered. He's not stepping foot on this land, and if he does, he'll find out real quick that I don't handle men who hurt women quietly either. Delia studied him for a long moment, something searching in her gaze, as though she were trying to determine whether his steadiness was genuine or simply another performance of safety that would eventually crack the way Elias's early kindness had cracked. But the days that followed offered her nothing but consistency. Caleb brought her meals himself rather than sending the housekeeper, always knocking first, always waiting for her voice before entering. He never raised his tone, not even when one of the ranch hands accidentally startled her badly enough that she dropped a plate, shattering it across the kitchen floor while flinching as though expecting punishment that never came. He simply knelt down, helped her gather the pieces, and told her plates broke sometimes, and it didn't matter one bit. Slowly, carefully, the wariness in Delia began to soften into something closer to trust. She began helping around the house as her ribs healed. Small tasks at first, then larger ones, finding in the rhythm of ranch work a kind of steadying purpose she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. She was good with the horses, gentle and unafraid despite everything, and Caleb noticed the way the animals responded to her calm, patient hands, the same way his own hardened heart had begun, quietly, responding to her presence in his home. Never seen you smile this much, boss. His foreman, an old-timer named Duke, who'd worked the Whitfield land since Caleb's father ran it, remarked one afternoon, watching Caleb laugh at something Delia had said while they worked side by side mending fence. Not since your ma passed, and that's saying something. She's been through enough darkness to last 3 lifetimes, Caleb said quietly. Least I can do is make sure the days she spends here have a little light in them. That all it is? Kindness? Caleb didn't answer right away. Watching Delia across the yard, the late afternoon sun catching gold in her hair, she laughed at something one of the barn cats had done. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind that hadn't existed in her at all when she first arrived. Started that way, he admitted finally. Isn't sure that's all it is anymore. 3 weeks after she collapsed on his porch, the trouble Delia had feared finally arrived. A rider came up the drive at speed, and Caleb recognized the look of him before he'd even dismounted. A big man with a hard, ruined face and eyes that carried the particular ugliness of someone accustomed to getting his way through fear rather than earning it honestly. I'm looking for my wife, Elias Frost said, not bothering with pleasantries, his gaze sweeping the yard with proprietary menace. Word in town says a woman matching her description's been seen out this way. She belongs to me, and I mean to take her home. Caleb stepped forward, positioning himself deliberately between Elias and the house, his posture relaxed but his eyes hard as flint. Don't know what you're talking about. Don't play games with me, Elias snapped, his horse shifting nervously beneath the sudden tension in his grip. She's my property, my wife, and the law says a man's got the right to collect his own wife. The law, Caleb said slowly. Doesn't much care for a man who beats a woman half to death and calls it collecting property. His voice remained level, but something dangerous had entered it now, something that made even Elias's bravado falter slightly. I've got a doctor's testimony about the state she arrived in. I've got half a dozen ranch hands who will swear to it in front of any judge in this territory. You want to talk about the law, Frost? We can absolutely talk about the law. Elias's face reddened with fury, and beneath it, the first flicker of genuine uncertainty. This isn't your business, Whitfield, whatever lies she's fed you. I've seen the bruises myself, Caleb said, his voice dropping lower, harder, each word deliberate. Seen the cracked ribs? Watched a grown woman flinch at the sound of a dropped plate like she was waiting to be struck for it. Those aren't lies, Frost. Those are facts written plain across her body, and you put them there. He took a step closer, and despite being on horseback, Elias found himself leaning back slightly in the saddle. Now you've got exactly one chance to turn that horse around and ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of. Or I promise you, every man on this ranch will make certain you understand exactly what it feels like to be afraid of someone bigger than you. For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Then Elias's gaze flicked toward the house, where Delia had appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion, standing tall despite the fear evident in her rigid posture, no longer the broken, collapsed figure who had whispered for help on a stranger's porch. "Delia!" Elias called out, his voice shifting, attempting a wounded, wheedling tone entirely at odds with the violence Caleb had just described. "Sweetheart, come home. We can work this out, same as always." "There is no working this out," Delia said, and her voice, though it trembled slightly, carried a strength Caleb had watched her rebuild piece by careful piece over 3 weeks. "I'm not coming back, Elias. Not now, not ever. Whatever you thought you owned, you lost it the night I walked out that door." Elias's face twisted with fury, but Caleb's hard, unwavering presence, combined with Duke and 2 other ranch hands who had quietly appeared with rifles resting easy but visible against their shoulders, made whatever violent instinct might have driven him forward retreat instead into cowardice. "You'll regret this," he spat, wheeling his horse around. "Both of you." "Doubtful," Caleb said flatly, watching him ride away in a cloud of dust and impotent rage. "But you're welcome to keep riding in this direction and finding out for certain." When the sound of hoofbeats had faded entirely, Delia's legs seemed to give out beneath her, and Caleb crossed the yard quickly, catching her before she could fall, holding her steady while she shook, the aftermath of confronting the fear that had chased her 300 miles finally crashing over her all at once. "He's gone," Caleb said softly, his arms secure around her. "He's not coming back, Delia. I promise you that." "You don't know that," she whispered against his chest. "I know that a man like that only has power over people who let him believe he does," Caleb said. "You just showed him, in front of witnesses, in front of the law, if it ever comes to that you're not afraid anymore. That takes his power away entirely." She pulled back slightly to look up at him, tears standing bright in her eyes, and something passed between them in that moment that neither of them had quite let themselves acknowledge before, not through 3 weeks of careful kindness and patient distance. "Why did you do all this?" she asked softly. "Take me in? Stand up to him? Risk everything for a stranger who collapsed on your porch?" Caleb was quiet a moment, his hand coming up gently to brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch careful, questioning, ready to withdraw at the slightest sign it wasn't welcome. "Started because it was the right thing to do," he said honestly. "Any decent person would have done the same. But somewhere along the way, watching you get your strength back, watching you laugh again, watching you handle my horses better than half my hired hands, I stopped thinking of you as someone I was helping and started thinking of you as someone I couldn't imagine this ranch, this life, without." His voice grew rougher, more uncertain than she'd ever heard it. "I know it's too soon to say something like that. I know what you've survived, and the last thing you need is another man pushing feelings on you before you're ready. So I'm not asking for anything. Just wanted you to know the truth of it." Delia's tears fell freely now, but there was nothing broken in them, only a quiet, overwhelming relief. "I've spent 2 years believing love meant learning to survive someone," she whispered. "I'd forgotten it could mean this instead. Safety, patience, someone who protects you without expecting anything in return." "That's the only kind of love worth having," Caleb said quietly. "I think," Delia said, her voice steadying even as fresh tears traced down her cheeks, "I might be ready to stop being afraid of what comes next." He kissed her then, gently, carefully, giving her every chance to pull away. And when she didn't, when she leaned into him instead with a certainty that had been rebuilding quietly inside her for 3 weeks, something settled in Caleb's chest that felt, for the first time since his mother passed, entirely and completely like home. The months that followed brought healing neither of them had dared hope for so soon. Delia's ribs mended fully, and with them, slowly, the deeper wounds that didn't show on the surface, the flinching at sudden movements, the careful watchfulness that had governed every moment of her days for 2 long years. Caleb never once rushed her, never once made her feel indebted for the safety and kindness he offered so freely. And it was that patience, more than any grand gesture, that finally convinced her the world still held good men within it. Word came through official channels some months later that Elias Frost had gotten himself into trouble in a neighboring territory, drunk and violent once too often, and had landed himself in a jail cell that would keep him well occupied for years to come. Delia received the news with quiet relief rather than triumph. A woman finally free to close a door on her past without needing to look back through it again. They married the following spring, a small, warm gathering at the ranch, Duke standing as witness with tears he gruffly denied having, the doctor who had first tended her wounds toasting the recovery he called nothing short of remarkable. Delia wore a simple ivory dress, wildflowers woven through her hair, and when she walked toward Caleb across the yard where she had once collapsed broken and afraid, there remained nothing of that frightened, wounded woman in her eyes, only a steady, radiant peace that had been 3 long years in the making. "You saved my life that night," she told him quietly, as they stood together after the ceremony, watching the sun set gold and warm across the land that had become, so completely and unexpectedly, her home. "I know you don't like hearing it put that plainly, but it's true." "You saved your own life," Caleb said, pulling her close. "Walking out that door, surviving 300 miles of dark and fear to find safety. All I did was open a door and refuse to let anyone close it on you again." "That's not nothing," Delia said softly. "That's everything." She had arrived on his porch with nothing but 2 whispered words and a body that had nearly given out from the effort of carrying her that far. They hurt me. Words spoken in the last desperate reach of a woman who had almost stopped believing safety existed anywhere in the world. She never had to whisper those words in fear again. And Caleb, who had opened his door to a stranger without a moment's hesitation, never once regretted the life that decision had built for both of them, a life rooted not in the fear she had fled, but in the quiet, unshakable safety she had finally truly found. If this story touched your heart tonight, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and let me know what part of Caleb and Delia's story moved you most. These stories remind us that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply keep walking towards safety, even in the dark, even when hope feels impossible to hold on to. If this journey warmed your heart, please subscribe and stay with me a while longer, because there are so many more stories of courage, healing, and love still waiting to be told.